Hi, I'd like to welcome you to our SMC October Employer Event, which was obviously postponed from the September event. So thank you for all joining and being able to join us today. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of culture and leadership with Stephanie Boyce, from the President of the Law Society for England and Wales. Just before we get started, I'm Paula Kemp. I'm the Head of Employment Engagement in SMC. And as I've mentioned, we'll go into a deep dive with Stephanie in a moment. We'll then have opportunities for you to put your questions in the Q&A and for those questions to be answered. And then we'll also then be able to signpost some next steps and resources in the future. So just a few housekeeping tips. If you could remain on mute, that would be great. Please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions. You may want to wait a bit later because your question might be answered as we go through some set questions that we've got already. But you may want to spark things off straight away. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We have actually disabled the chat function. So any questions, if they could go in the Q&A. This webinar will and is being recorded, and we will be able to share the slides with you afterwards, and there'll be a recap as well for you to share with colleagues a few days down the line. And the transcript closed captions are available if you want to turn those on. So if I just give you a bit of an introduction to our guest speaker today. So Stephanie Boyce is the President of the Law Society of England and Wales. She was admitted as a solicitor in 2002 and has a wealth of experience in corporate governance, regulatory framework and professional regulation. And that's obviously across all industries. She holds a Masters of Law in Public Law and Global Governance from King's College, University of London, and is a Fellow of the Chartered Governance Institute and an Honorary Professor of Law, the Dickinson Poon School of Law, King's College, London. Stephanie became the Law Society's 6th woman president and the first person of colour to hold the post back in 2021. She comes from a single parent working class background and is British born daughter of Caribbean immigrants. She attended a comprehensive school and worked in a variety of jobs before embarking on a law degree. So I'm sure we'll explore this a bit further as we talk. Stephanie sits on the City of London's Socioeconomic Diversity Task Force, which is looking at boosting social mobility at senior levels in financial and professional services. And in 2020, Stephanie was voted onto the Governance Hot 100 board influencer and made the Power List 100 most influential Black people in the UK in both 2021 and 2022. So welcome, Stephanie. So delighted you can join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think the first question I want to ask you is around the fact that you made social mobility a key priority when you took on the presidency of the Law Society back in 2021. I just want to find out a bit more about why that was important to you, but also, as I know your tenure comes to a close, what impact do you think it has had on both the sector, the legal sector, but also wider organisations that you've been working with?
Well, absolutely. I think your introduction said some of it already. Given my low socioeconomic start in life, and the narrative that others tried to tell me around that I wouldn't become a solicitor because of my low socioeconomic background. But there is something liberating about telling one story and sharing your story. And to borrow some of the words of Nelson Mandela, when we tell our stories, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. And so for me, it was very personal. And that was when I became an office holder, well, in fact, as Deputy Vice President-elect, as I was in April 2019. But of course, have really been able to spotlight social mobility, stepping up to become president, as I did in March 2021. So I know that many aspiring solicitors are still facing similar barriers to enter in the profession. And the most recent diversity statistics from law firms show, or gathered by the Solicitors Regulation Authority, show that socioeconomic diversity is still sorely lacking in the solicitor profession. 58% of lawyers come from a professional background. meaning that their parents were in occupations classified as professional rather than intermediate or working class, compared to 37% nationally. 23% of solicitors have been privately educated, as opposed to 7% of the wider UK population. And this percentage is far higher than for financial services, accounting, management consultancy, meaning that there is less socioeconomic diversity in the legal sector than the overall benchmarks for financial and professional services. So there is a lot more that we still need to do to make sure that the legal profession reflects the society it serves. And that's across all of the protected characteristics, and including social mobility. So that is why I have made social mobility one of the priorities of my presidency of the Law Society. Working to support and challenge the profession to take difficult but necessary action to boost social mobility is incredibly important and rewarding, as I enjoy meeting with aspiring solicitors, hearing their stories, aspiring solicitors and qualified solicitors, but hearing their stories as much as speaking to leaders and firms across the UK and globally, and as to how they are planning to remove barriers to entry and enable progression for solicitors from working class backgrounds. So it's crucial that the profession, as I say, reflects the society we serve. And that's from the high street all the way to the High Court. It's fundamental. This is fundamental to ensuring the future success and maintaining trust and confidence in our justice system. We, without removing barriers for talented people from all walks of life to reach their full potential as solicitors, our legal system will be weakened. The determinants must be aptitude, ability, skills, not your background, not any of those protected characteristics. So boosting social mobility at all levels has absolutely been my priority, and will mean that we are better able to support clients from all backgrounds and improve opportunities for all in our communities and in our profession.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephanie. And I think you touched on it a bit there in terms of talking to CEOs and organisations across the UK in different sectors. So, and I know sort of building on that is part of the culture, and that's the discussion that's open today in terms of how for us to discuss the importance of culture and leadership within organisations in driving social mobility. So I wonder, perhaps we could start with, what would your definition of culture, organisational culture, be, and who do you see is responsible for that in an organisation?
So I see culture, organisational culture. It's about actions, it's about behaviours, values, and practices that shape the everyday experiences and interactions of those in that organisation. It's the set of spoken and, more significantly, the unspoken rules that create that environment in which we work. So for me, culture is multifaceted, it's complex, it's unique to each workplace, and it involves everyone. Diverse representation on its own does not guarantee inclusive culture and practices. That's why it's important to consider diversity and inclusion separately. But increasing representation alone might not necessarily lead to an inclusive culture if there is still a dominant culture by a dominant group, which excludes a large number of employees from minority backgrounds. So if the working environment can feel like an exclusive club for the few, regardless of how representative or diverse the whole workforce is, some of the cultural indicators worth looking at in order to measure how inclusive the culture is could be changes in staff survey scores, indicators of psychological safety, like engagement with initiatives, projects, willingness of staff to bring up new ideas and thinking to the table. Is there somebody in your team who never says anything, who's very quiet? Concerns being raised about negative behaviours. This may initially go up, go up to the top if you are speaking, or if you are seeking to successfully reduce those negative behaviors. And just a multitude of things, but everybody in my mind is responsible for the culture. We all feed into it, we all make it up, we all contribute to it.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we often hear organisations say they want employees to bring their whole selves to work, whatever that statement means for people. But I think building trust with employees is key to enabling this. And you touched about it a bit there, talking about staff surveys, but what else can leaders do to build that trust in terms of people feeling that they belong to an organisation?
Through action. Leaders can show commitment through action, and they can listen also. But, what we have to ask ourselves as leaders, are we treating people fairly? Be visible advocates for socio-economic diversity at all levels of the organisation. Are you prioritising D&I and social mobility in your business strategy? And is it aligning with your business objectives? Are you fully committing resources, whether that's staff in D&I teams or properly rewarding and supporting someone who would take on that remit? Introduce protected time for D&I activities, as part of an employee's existing roles. Allocate sufficient budgets for D&I activities and networks. Senior individuals can sponsor. There can be explicit support and recognition for staff networks and their activity. So it's crucial, because a lot of D&I activity led by volunteers can become unsustainable if you don't have that commitment, that budgetary, that monetary commitment behind it. And it can also lead to burnout from people from marginalized groups. So listen to employees, take concerns seriously, involve people as much as possible in plans, and explain decisions or how their feedback is going to consider to keep people informed. There's one thing I've found is that when people can see the journey, see what role they play, that they are part of that journey, they're a lot more receptive.
Brilliant, thank you. That's I find that really interesting, because obviously lots of people do run feedback surveys, and I think it's really important for leaders to show where they're on their journey in terms of, we've received your feedback, these things we can change immediately, these things might take us longer, we need your support in doing this or this. That's really crucial. So that's brilliant. Thank you. I know you sit on the City of London task force, and I think that's just about to close up in November. Yes. And it was commissioned by the UK government, particularly Boyce and the Treasury, to improve socioeconomic diversity at senior levels in financial and professional services. Are you able to share discussions you've heard through this that would be maybe relevant to organisations in any industry about what leaders can do if the current leadership team doesn't have the same cultural identities as the staff? How do you then address this in building inclusive cultures? And how do you avoid alienating some people within your organisation?
So yes, I have been part of the task force's work stream, which is running an industry-wide consultation on how government, regulators, sector bodies can incentivize employer action. And through roundtables across the country, we have heard participants say time and time again that career progression in financial and professional services remains a mystery for those without the career capital to navigate the unwritten rules. Some people call them codes. But participants raised the lack of transparency around progression routes as a barrier to socioeconomic diversity at senior levels. And while the policy itself may be clear, there is often a gap between what should happen and what actually happens, which makes it difficult to know how to progress without insider knowledge or career capital. And a lot of this can come down to having senior role models. So senior role models from lower socioeconomic backgrounds play an important part, an important role, excuse me, in signalling the possibility of success for others who identify identify with them based on this shared identity. And that's why, people have often said to me, why do you tell your story? Absolutely, I tell my story. I'm not embarrassed, I'm not ashamed, but it's the amount of people who have been who said thank you for sharing your story. I thought it was just me. Or assumptions have been made about my background that I have never corrected, but now that I feel able to. However, conscious or subconscious efforts to conform to an organizational culture that favors what is considered traditionally middle-class behaviors, example, certain social activities, sports and holidays, can make those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds harder to identify on that basis. So, when these identities are hidden through choice or otherwise, more junior employees, what we know is from a lower socioeconomic background or otherwise, miss out on this valuable connection. So as leaders, senior leaders from underrepresented groups, we may consciously distance ourselves from the stigmatized identity to avoid becoming, hyper visible. And then that goes back to my question, when people say, why do you tell your story? Or deviate from a canon of how partners should look and behave. I was told you don't look like a solicitor, you don't sound like a solicitor, consider something else. So even if there are shared cultural identities, it's easier said than done. So, so some tips that I would share is about how to go about building inclusive cultures. Look at the imagery your business uses around the building, the decor, the pictures in your buildings, your website. If those of us from characteristic backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, can we see ourselves, in that space, in those rooms? Because it may reveal assumptions about who the firm employs and who it serves. Consider how your business, how you do business with clients, or organize social or networking events. Recently in the Law Gazette, some colleagues wrote about the drinking culture. Is there a problem, a drinking culture problem in the legal profession? There is a tendency to focus on after hours drinking or certain kinds of sporting events. Are there more varied or inclusive options that could be considered? Not everybody drinks. Yes, I've been fortunate to go skiing, but not everybody, has been or can afford to. Are you promoting diverse role models? Because they are important in breaking down stereotypes and building inclusion. So ensure you support colleagues, across the piece. It can feel risky being in the spotlight or being seen as a token representative for an entire group, but make it clear how people can raise concerns about behavior, provide and advertise a variety of channels, and in a number of different ways. People learn differently, and ensure that there is a channel for insights and feedback to be heard at senior levels too, so that they can take action to improve culture.
Brilliant, thank you. Our audience today, actually, Stephanie, is comprised of leaders, business leaders, HR professionals, but also those who are from members of social mobility networks within their own organisations. And they're all interested in changing their organisation from grassroots up. You have touched a bit about staff networks already, but I think, is there anything in particular that you think staff networks support the work that leaders do?
Well, absolutely. Staff networks can be a crucial way to open up communication lines between senior leaders and the rest of the organization, and reach corners of your organization. Only peers or people who have shared identities can, by providing a safe space to discuss issues and drive change on issues that matter to them. One of the things I did was, I said when I went on tour, President on tour, and when I did my Dare to Dream speeches, I said, I will come to your organization and speak, and you can invite anyone you like, because aspiring solicitors are found everywhere. We're found, we're cleaners, we're in the post room, we're in the canteen, we're everywhere. And it's important to give everyone the access to those networks and a safe space to discuss issues and drive change on issues that matter to them. So networks can run events, be involved in policy development on issues affecting employees, and can act as a champion for D&I in different teams, reaching different members of staff, as I said, through peers, in different places. So internal communication is important, and an important change Social Mobility Network could make is start an honest conversation about class and privilege. As those with shared identities are more likely to be from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, fit in and progress, working from home, whilst, senior colleagues, might be found working at home. Those from a low socioeconomic background may not have the resources to work from home. And then, are they being disadvantaged because they're not learning, in that old favored way that we learned, through osmosis or through those, watching and learning. So it's all those things that we need to consider. And some of those conversations about class may be uncomfortable, they may be challenging, but when more peers and colleagues start sharing stories and discussing this, it could help normalize and destigmatize conversations about class and create an environment of openness that will lead to organizational change if members are involved in that policy department and that rollout and evaluation.
Brilliant, thank you. I think you probably answered my next question, because I was going to say, what advice would you give those on the call today whose organisations aren't yet focused on the socioeconomic inclusion to approach their HR team or senior leadership teams to start the conversation? But I think it's that, isn't it? Get groups together and for them to have a conversation and bring that topic to life, really.
Absolutely. And of course, lead with data. Have you got a data strategy? Evidence and rationale why socioeconomic inclusion is important. But it is about establishing those conversations, bringing the evidence with you, and ensuring that I've long said rights, but not at the exclusion of other people's rights. It's got to be a conversation, and one of the reasons why I focused on social mobility as well is that for me, if you're poor, you're poor. It doesn't matter, the color of your skin, your sexuality, gender, and so forth. So it's important that we have those open and frank conversations and that people feel included.
Brilliant, thank you. And you sort of touched upon this a bit there in terms of flexible working, but obviously the way we work has fundamentally changed, even in the time of you as president, your role within presidency. And we know that it's a mixed bag out there. So some employers are fully embracing flexible working and hybrid working, and others, are calling for a return to the office. And what is clear is flexible working has had benefits for inclusion, but there's also some challenges which you touched upon in terms of, learning through osmosis, especially around, building work relationships, which plays a really important part in the culture of an organisation. What have you seen that people are doing well in this space in terms of being able to still retain the culture, an organisation's inclusive culture, but to be very mixed in terms of the way people are working?
Well, absolutely. But I think, excuse me, I think what works well will depend on the individual context. So remote working doesn't always mean flexible working, and it's important to maintain that degree of flexibility. For example, around working hours to be inclusive. Some ideas for best practice we have heard from our members are regular in-person days. How are you going to build camaraderie, team, allyship, supervisors proactively sharing their thinking, and use of technology for collaboration that would normally happen over the shoulder. Having secondary supervisors assigned to junior staff, for when the main supervisor is not in the office, which allows juniors to learn from a range of people. Treat video calls as in-person meetings and ask for accessibility requirements in advance. One of the things I certainly have seen more and more is that less people, when you're on Zoom meetings, team meetings, whatever, less people have their cameras on. And some of that is for technical reasons, i.e. the bandwidth is better if the camera is not on. Excuse me. But how are we remaining engaged? Excuse me a minute. Sorry. How how are you remaining engaged and connected with colleagues? Sorry, I'm going to have a drink of water.
No problem. I feel your pain. I'm just getting over a cold myself.
Right, that might do it.
Brilliant. So I think there's that engagement piece, and engaging with your culture is really important. And I know, one bad apple can sometimes spoil the whole lot. And so there is building an inclusive culture can absolutely be derailed by an underlying informal culture, which you touched on before in terms of, the actions where you said, you've got to, what could be done doesn't necessarily mean what is done or what should be done. What sort of things would you say that you've seen, you've witnessed that have had a negative impact on an individual or an organisation, and what can others within that organisation, probably especially leaders, do to mitigate against informal culture?
I think it's incumbent upon leaders to ensure that that there isn't cliquey behaviour, that others are not feeling excluded from or ill-equipped to participate in social activities, such as, for instance, colleagues sharing their experience around a luxury holiday, perhaps may, promote or perpetuate that sense of camaraderie and participation, because if you can't afford a holiday in the first place, let alone a luxury holiday, it places colleagues potentially at a financial disadvantage, and exclude them from being able to collectively recreate shared experiences, because they may never, as I say, have been on a holiday. So so feeling excluded, as I say, make sure that everyone feels part of that conversation. So even if you're talking about your luxury holiday, you can, there's a way to say things and there's a way not to say things, but it's ensuring that people don't feel excluded, and people do feel included. And I think we all have to think about that, because we can still, because I'm not saying don't share your story, don't share what you've done, but just be mindful that not everyone will have had that shared experience and be able to contribute to that conversation.
Yeah, so it's kind of widening the conversation. Now, I use it when it's happened to me before, was when a new member, this is outside of the SMC, a new new leader came in and started to talk about, let's all get to know each other on a shared MS Teams or something. This is me, this is my family, these are my pets. And everyone else followed with that exactly the same. And I felt excluded because I haven't got any pets. I've obviously got family, but I haven't got an immediate family. And it's like, well, I don't know now what to put, because 15 people ahead of me have just followed suit, really. And so it was, how do you make sure that conversation's wider and it doesn't get narrowed down by everyone else just responding in the same manner?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I did a panel last year. And I think there's a panel, it's a women in law panel. I can't remember the exact name, but there was about 6 of us, and I was the last to speak because I was on the end. And all of the ladies before me spoke about, their partners, working from home. They spoke about their partners. They spoke about their children, and how their life evolved around, who was going to put the bin out, who was going to, do this, do that. And of course, when it got to me, I thought, well, I haven't biologically got any children and I haven't got a partner. So, I said, well, I'm going to speak up for all of us, all of the single ladies out there. That, and it's important to remember that for a variety of reasons, not everybody, may be able to share in those, as I say, shared experiences. And it's just being mindful of that. And sometimes you've got to be brave, and stick your head above the parapet. But it's creating, and leaders being mindful of creating that inclusive culture.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to ask you one further question. Then we've got a few questions that are coming in the Q&A, and please, people still do respond to those. So, given it takes time to make changes within an organisation, and we've seen this with gender parity, building trust without fast results can be really challenging for organisations and for leaders. What are the things organisations can put in place to ensure other voices from the minority or those less likely to engage, can be heard and have a say? And I think, as well, as you're kind of moving out of your tenure as well, I'm sure the Law Society is thinking about how do you make that change sustainable? So when the new president comes in, there may be a new focus. So how do you embed what you've got already? So
so absolutely. Let's take the first one first. It's going back to truly open channels of communication, and that goes back to what I said earlier. That when people feel and can see and can hear, the role that they will play, they can see their part in the journey. To ensure that staff networks are recognised, that they're resourced, that they're informed. What is your staff survey and feedback mechanisms? Are they formal? Are they informal? Are they through managers, HR? Because some staff might feel comfortable raising issues anonymously. I remember there was one organisation I worked at. They had a box, strategically placed in a location where nobody could see you put in your notes in that box if you wanted to. But empowering staff by trusting them to do their work and excel will always lead to, in my mind, higher engagement and a sense of inclusion. So reverse mentoring schemes, we've heard lots about that, where a senior member of staff is mentored by a junior member of staff, and sometimes from a diverse background, can help encourage those in majority groups and senior roles to reflect and see things from that perspective of the other. So how do you make change sustainable? Far often, there is this race, this pressure, this immediate pressure, to do something, an urgency to do something. But first, you need to establish the rationale for why you want to make change, and that should be grounded in context and evidence base. With a combination of business, social, or ethical drivers, which may vary for different parts of the business. But ensure your goals are aligned to your rationale for D&I and driven by what your engagement and data has told you. Be ambitious, be realistic. Have staff. Do staff know what those goals are? Are they part of the discussion? Can they see themselves affecting change? And start thinking about the long-term strategic goals you set. Then work backwards to plan the different activities and steps needed to achieve them. And this will help establish a causal pathway between action and how they lead to outcomes to what you want to see. And when people, as I say, when people can see themselves as part of that journey, they are more likely to buy into it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to open up the questions. So we've got the first question. What tips or strategies can you suggest to get senior leaders on board with social mobility? I think we've covered some of this. Is there any more tips out there?
Well, I think it's it's normalizing that social mobility conversation. Get people to publicly share their stories, as I have done. Get lots of people involved. Build a social mobility network or champion forum, because momentum happens when people get involved. And build trust with leaders speaking out and participating in internal communications about the importance of the agenda. Like I said previously, lots of people who've said, senior partners and so forth, who said, I come from, I had free school meals or whatever, dinners, but people had made the assumption, without me saying anything, people had made the assumption that I was, privately educated and so forth, and I never corrected them. So it's about being able to own your story, own your truth, And getting leaders, as I say, so we're not talking about, so we're normalizing that conversation around about social mobility, and and around what university we went to, where we practice, and so forth.
Brilliant. What if, so you mentioned at the very top that in the solicitor's profession, 73% of people come from a higher socioeconomic background, 73% of leaders, I think it was that you said. So obviously that means that you're quite restricted on some role models at certain levels in an organisation, and therefore there might not be people that at that level to kind of speak out about this topic. So if people from the lower levels of an organisation are finding that a challenge, is there anything you've seen anybody do to kind of bring in outside leaders from other industries or whatever? Have you seen anything like that happen where those leaders can speak to those leaders? That makes sense.
So it's 58% of lawyers come from a professional background, and that is compared to 37% nationally. Yes, absolutely. Different organizations, different institutions bring in those from other backgrounds to share their experiences. It's about speaking about your personal story, and there are, as I've alluded to, there are individuals, senior leaders who were recipients of free school dinners, who have come from low socioeconomic background. So it's getting them as well to say, yes, I did too. But also, all of that aside, it's about, as I say, normalizing that discussion around social mobility, talking about it, and ensuring that it's a space where people feel comfortable enough to want to share their story and talk about it. So when I say that I grew up on a council estate, and I put a post out on social media, and lots of people wrote back and said, well, there's nothing wrong with the council estate. I didn't suggest there was, but the point is that I'm showing as to where my starting point was, where I started, and as we've long said, where you start should not define where you end up.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. There's another question around what are the benefits to the profession of law, but I guess this could also cut across any industry and their clients, of embracing people from different social backgrounds. So this is always, I think, weighs up the business case and the moral case, and kind of, what's your thoughts on that when people ask you that sort of question?
Well, absolutely. We know it's not just a moral imperative. It makes business sense to have diversity of thought, of character, of people, everywhere around the table in your business. A number of researchers, papers have been produced, statistics that suggest that when you have diversity in your businesses, those businesses are more productive, they're more profitable. And it's and I've long said it's not enough to give somebody a diverse voice a seat at the table. You must ensure that when you give diverse colleagues a seat at the table, that their voice is heard, heard and respected.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's really important in terms of the sort of the heard and expected. And the question that's come up is it mentions in particular about apprenticeship pathways into law, but I think it absolutely cuts across kind of what we know about apprenticeships altogether. So the question is, apprenticeship pathways into law, particularly the solicitor's apprenticeship, could disrupt inequalities in access to the profession. How do you see the role of apprenticeships in achieving social mobility aspirations in the legal profession? But I guess we could also widen that out. We've obviously got a lot of people on the call that aren't necessarily in the legal profession. We could consider that across the board. So
apprenticeships, of course, do create, wider opportunities to enter various professions. And what we're seeing is in the legal profession, a greater uptake of solicitor apprenticeships, but more needs to be done. And of course, the government could remove some of the restrictions around the apprenticeship levy to ensure that there is greater uptake. that there is greater knowledge of the benefits of apprenticeship, because, for instance, I was in Cornwall a couple of weeks ago. I'm told that there was, one solicitor apprenticeship in the entirety of Cornwall. So more needs to be done to ensure that businesses understand what can be done with the levy, and around solicitor apprenticeship. And aspiring solicitors also know about apprenticeships as well, that it's another route. It's work as you learn in order to get into the profession. You don't just have to go to university, because some people are not going to be in a position to go to university to acquire some of that debt. And if you're willing and dedicated, then you can go via the solicitor apprenticeship route, which provides an alternative to the traditional route as we know it. So more can be done, and there is a recognition in the legal sphere that more could be done to ensure that people are very aware of the benefits of solicitor apprenticeships.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've also done some work at the SMC where we kind of build on employers considering apprenticeships, because I think a lot of people think that it solves your social mobility kind of routes in access, and that's not necessarily been the case. The data's not necessarily showing us that. So how do you make sure it is reaching those from lower socioeconomic background, your apprenticeship levy spend and your apprenticeship programs? So the key thing, I think, where you talked about making sure the evidence shows it, so the data you're collecting on these individuals when they come in the organisation, etc. Sorry, my voice has got a bit there. And
the support, of course, that individuals, because it's long, it can be up to 6 years. And somebody said to me the other day, they were 18 when they started studying, having never been in that environment before. So, it was quite, it was quite difficult for them. So making sure that the support is there as well, have colleagues got, what they need. We've had colleagues be in touch to ask us. We ran a social mobility roundtable in the northeast. And one of the things that was fed back at that roundtable was that somebody who lived on the outskirts of a major city had asked whether or not because they had been offered work experience, had asked whether or not they needed a passport to get into that city to go to work. So, we get questions about, what should I wear? Let's be explicit. I mean, I've got an invitation on my desk somewhere, that talks about lounge suit and cocktail dress. Well, most people who know me know I don't like dresses anyway. But, I mean, I do my own thing anyway. But, what do we mean by that? Because I struggle, sometimes with, as I say, but I'm confident enough that I will turn up to something dressed in my own version of something. But, what do we mean when we say that?
Yeah, build a really strong foundation and framework around all of your programs for young people, so they absolutely understand what is meant, because that's where social capital definitely plays for some individuals, stronger for some individuals than others. Brilliant. So we've sort of covered the first part of this question, but I think the empathy part of the end of the question is quite interesting. So I'm going to ask it. So it says, what is the best way to understand someone else from a different background in the law? But we could use that as generally. And I think when we say different background, I think we've also got to think about those from a higher professional background and working class backgrounds. And there's, understandings from both sides, really. And then when they haven't had your experience, and i.e. they've said, how is empathy created without your life experience? So that's quite an interesting one.
How's empathy created without life experiences?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is an interesting question, because part of me kind of thinks, unless you've been, living somewhere for a long time, you must have experienced, diverse colleagues, maybe not in person, but certainly on the television. The television, has thrown up some real issues that have brought it into our homes around some of the struggles that fellow citizens, I heard something yesterday at a lunch I was at, that, it was it was an eye-watering number of students, school students, who go to school hungry, who do not have substantial meals. So I think it's very difficult, but if you have been in a space where you potentially have not been exposed to diverse colleagues, it's incumbent upon us all to ensure that, as I say, not my rights, not your rights, at the exclusion of other people's rights, but we understand where, it's our human, I would hope, our human nature to be empathetic to to our surroundings, and to be mindful that we're not all the same. We are different, and those differences should be celebrated, not denigrated, and we should try to understand better, educate ourselves, as to different cultures, different characteristics. And there are different, there's differences in social mobility when we speak about that. Somebody, for instance, assumptions, don't make assumptions. Somebody, just because somebody has has been privately educated, doesn't always mean that they come from, that they haven't come from a disadvantaged background, because they could be there because of a scholarship, as opposed to the fact that, their parents have paid for them to get there. So we've all got unconscious biases, and we just have to make sure that, that we recognize those, we challenge ourselves, and we challenge others. If we hear something that's not right, that's not okay, and I'm not suggesting you do it in a aggressive way, or in a confrontational way, but you can do so by just suggesting to someone that they may, rethink their thinking around whatever it is that they have said or done.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think also it ties back, Stephanie, to the point you made in terms of open conversation and open communication. The Social Mobility Commission has a resource about Let's Talk About Class, and gives some really clear guidance on how you can create that safe space for everybody to talk about and learn from each other about those differences. And I think, people like Business in the Community have Let's Talk About Race sessions that they run, and I'm sure membership organisations like the Law Society do similar in terms of opening up that discussion on how can we build empathy on finding out more about others and their experiences. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think I've got a few other resources to share with people. So someone says, my organisation has been endeavouring to close the gap in terms of differential employment rates for people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and also those from low socio-mobility backgrounds. The gap is still gaping. How do we accelerate closing the gap? So this, I guess, is about kind of the routes into the employer.
Well, absolutely. Through those networks that I've spoken about, through those leaders, and through all of us, actually, as I've always said, we've all got a role to play in all of this. But we have to ensure meaningful change. Data, as I said, around data strategy, are our behaviors conducive to that closing that gap culture? Do we provide active bystander training, or do we just stand by and watch? Do we reinforce positive, encouraging, powerful behavior? Do we explicitly thank staff, give recognition for examples of inclusive behavior? Are we creating an inclusive culture where people feel empowered, they feel enabled, they have a sense of belonging? Because what we see is that where people don't feel that they belong, or that they can't be themselves, turnover rate is high, productivity rate is high, and so forth. So it's everyone's responsibility to ensure that the culture is reflective of those goals, those aims, objectives, and that we are demonstrating, as I say, those values in our behaviors, our actions, our words. We're being fair, we're being equitable, we're giving people the opportunity to thrive, we're creating that culture. And that's a responsibility that belongs to all of us, not just some of us.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephanie. And I guess my final question to you is what's next for Stephanie in terms of following on from the presidency? Where will we see you pop up again? I'm sure you'll be very active in the space still.
Yes, yes, that's the hope. So I'll leave office after 19 months, the longest serving president, tomorrow afternoon. And I was just trying to think, other than I think this is my last public speech as president event. But what next? I'm going to take some time to reflect, rest, reacquaint myself with my home, my family. But I leave office in the hope that I said it was my mission to leave the profession more diverse and inclusive than the one I entered, and I was clear, absolutely clear, that it must be a shared ambition, with each and every one of us playing our part. I have been proud to preside over our solicitor profession, proud of the way that we have galvanized ourselves around social mobility, D&I, access to justice, and so many other challenges that have come our way. A recognition that we have done lots, but there is still more to be done. And so I will be popping up every so often, continuing to champion and advocate for all of those things that mean so much to me and that I'm so passionate about, as well as campaigning for law to be taught in schools. All schools.
All schools, brilliant.
All schools.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you so much for joining us on your last week and for us to, I think it's quite nice and fitting that the SMC and the Law Society have come together for this final public outing as you as president. So thank you very much. And thanks to everyone in terms of their questions. If we haven't answered any and you've not asked them anonymously, we will be able to have a look at those and get back to you afterwards. And I'm sure we can, Stephanie and other colleagues in the Law Society, if they were very specific about law, we could also get them from get responses for them. So just from me, a couple of final slides on resources. So you may have seen that the SMC started an employers consultation. We're looking to find out what interventions have been working in your organisation. So some of the things that Stephanie's spoken about today, are you currently doing that organisation? What impact have you seen? What sort of level of resources does it take you to do it? So there's a short confidential online response. So if you visit our website there, but we'll also share this information with you after the event as well. And we're looking to then publish a report on what works by the end of the year. So please do have a look at that consultation and find out more regarding that. We've got a few more events coming up. So we've got Thursday, the 27th of October. Stephanie talked about reverse mentoring. We've got a session on mentoring as a tool to support social mobility. So please do register if you're able to attend that. We've got Eddie Fletcher from the Ministry of Justice, actually, who set up a cross-government mentoring program, which has gone from strength to strength. So he's going to talk about how you might be able to set up your own. And then we've got people from mentoring programs. So we've got one somebody who's a mentor and somebody who is a mentee talking about their experiences and just some of those pitfalls and how could you on a shoestring set up a mentoring program, or if indeed you've got a huge budget, it's the same sort of process. And then we're also launching or have launched our building blocks toolkit. So this is anyone just starting out can think about what things they could, smaller steps they could take to start looking at social mobility within their organisation. And my colleague Edward Donker is speaking with Anne Frankie of the Chartered Management Institute on the building blocks of social mobility in the workplace. So that's in November. So again, please do register for that. If you visit our socialmobilityworks.org website and go to the events page, you can find out how to do that. And then just finally, some resources that my colleagues have been posted in the chat. But in particular, we've got cross-industry, but we've got also financial and professional services employer toolkits, creative industries toolkits, and in the new year, we'll be publishing a retail sector one as well. So please do look at that. Some of the tips and hints, and especially about culture and leadership, can be found there. We have the Let's Talk About Class session. I have to say we ran it in the SMC about a year ago now, and it was brilliant in terms of opening up the conversation. So please do try that. We have a maturity assessment, so you can see where you are and what else you could be doing, adding to what you're already doing. And as I mentioned, this building blocks employer's guide. So please do visit those resources. And just remains for me to say thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks again to Stephanie for joining us and giving us her insights on what is her last week at the Law Society as president. And please do come along to future events. Many thanks.